Awesome. Right. Thanks for sticking around again. Solved that particular problem. So, quick start templates with the Salesforce CLI. So, the use case that I've got is I do offline mobile development from time to time with Salesforce, but I don't do it very often. So every time I start, it's like I'm starting again. My brain's turned into a reflective thing, and I haven't retained any of that information. So it's always like I'm going back to the docs, how do I do this, etc. And the thing is, when you're in an offline, building an offline application, you've got a number of things to remember. So to set it up in the first place, you need to create your smart store. It's kind of like your database. Then you need to create a soup inside that smart store, kind of like your table. Then you need to make a call to Salesforce to query it, which is quite like regular Salesforce. That's a SOCL. Then you get it back in a callback, and you upsert it into the soup. So I've got to do those things just to get set up. Then if I want to access the data, first off, I've got to think about the query. Do I want one record or do I want all records? Very rarely have to think in those terms. Then I create the query spec for the appropriate query. I execute the query against the soup. I then get a cursor back, and I can get up to, I think, 100 entries from that cursor. I process the entries. Then I get some more entries from the cursor, process the entries, etc. And if I'm then going to update the data, I have to upsert this into the soup. Remember that it's changed because I've only changed it locally. I haven't synchronized it with Salesforce. I then have to create a REST request to push that information up to Salesforce. I make a REST call out to do that, and then I get a call back with some results that I process, which may be chunked again. So quite a lot of things to remember, but the difficulty is that it's all very different to the normal database access that I do with Salesforce, which is through Apex, typically triggered from Visualforce or the Lightning components. So all of those things, if I do those once a year, it's like I'm starting from scratch every time. It's like I'm relearning and being re-onboarded. So what I did was I created myself a little quick start application called Disconnected, which I think would also make a very good album title. And the idea of this is it's just got some basic functionality. For a particular S object, it will go and fetch them from Salesforce. It will store them in a soup. I can click into them. I can do some basic updates, and I can synchronize that with Salesforce. So effectively, this gives me a starting point. It's not very clever. I've got no validation around the inputs. I've got no error handling, nothing like that. It literally just gives me a starting point. So having done that, I was then thinking, well, that's great. Yeah, so I've got this application. What I really want this to be is a template. I want it to be something that's easily reusable, that I can stamp it out next time I need to do something. So what that allows me to do is get big quick. I'm not starting from scratch every time thinking, what did I do, or going back and looking at other applications, trying to tease out bits of functionality. Thing is, if it's going to be a quick start template, it needs to be very easily located. So if I'm going to put it on somewhere like GitHub, I need to know where it is. It also needs to be as simple as possible. If I've got to start fiddling with it before I can do anything with it, I'm probably not going to bother. I'm not going to go and tease the information out of a previous application. So it's got to be something that I can easily get at and then I can easily start working with. So where to put it? I could put it on GitHub. I could clone it. I could change some things around. But I thought, well, at the moment, everything I do with Salesforce around the metadata API and quite a lot of regular data, I do through Salesforce CLI plugins, which means that all of my devs have got the Salesforce CLI installed as well, so they can ride off the back of this. So Salesforce CLI supports plugins, so this seemed like a really good opportunity to try it out. So not only does Salesforce CLI support plugins, the Salesforce CLI really is plugins. It's a thin wrapper around a bunch of plugins. So in the purple there, you've got the Salesforce CLI container. In the gray above that, you've got the kind of plugin architecture. We've got the core plugins, which is what everybody in the Salesforce ecosystem uses for the standard functionality. Then you've got the plugin generator if you've got a specific use case like I had. So in the green there, you can see that's my Quick Start plugin, which exists at the same level as the core plugins. There's an element called SFDX Core, and that's a core library provided by Salesforce, which gives me a load of functionality for free. It stops me having to worry about, not that I particularly did for this, but it stops me having to worry about how I authenticate against Salesforce, for example. So I've got SFDX Core, then on top of that I build my Quick Start code and my Quick Start files. So that's what I'm responsible for when I'm creating a plugin. Okay, to create a plugin, I simply execute the SFDX plugins generate. And this then puts out a little Yeoman, because it's built on Yeoman, so a nice little bit of ASCII art. Then it asks me some questions, and then it creates the plugin based on what I told it, which is kind of what gave me the idea in the first place for building myself a plugin to allow myself to do templates. Once the plugin's created, it's then really easy to install that into the Salesforce CLI. Simply run sfdx plugins link. And you can see there, it installs some dependencies, it runs the prepare script, and then it's done. And at this moment in time, I've not written any code. I've just told it some things about the name of the plugin, where it's going to live. I've then linked it to sfdx. And at that point in time, I can run the sample plugin that comes with it. I can do sfdx hello:org, give it a username, and then it connects to my Salesforce org, pulls down some basic information, the name of the org, the expiry date, and the org ID. So then, adding my own plugin to this, my quick start. So you've got the directory structure here on the left. So the convention is that you've got source, then you've got commands, and then that's where your commands live. So the standard one lives under hello, that was hello:org. In my case, I've created a directory called quick start. And then with quick start, underneath that, I've got a TypeScript file called offline.ts, which actually contains the command. So what that translates to is when it's linked to Salesforce CLI, I've automatically got a namespace of quick start, effectively, a topic of quick start, and then a subtopic or command of offline. And I get all that without really having to do any configuration. It's all through convention. The other thing that I add in as part of quick start is this templates directory. So the concept is the templates directory contains all of my templated apps, because I don't intend to just stop at one. This is just the example. Underneath that, I've got offline mobile, which is the name of my templated application. And underneath that, I've got the files that actually go to make up my template. FW7, Framework 7, is a framework for building iPhone-style applications. And then I've got a few bits and pieces that have actually got my application logic in them. So that's the structure of it. So now I'm going to jump out, and hopefully everything works, and show a demo. So what I need to do first is to execute my plugin. So sfdx quick start :offline. I tell it the directory I want to write the files into, which is in Xcode. And I tell it that I want it to be an account, is the S-object that we're working with. And as I try very hard to make sure I type correctly, I get number of employees. So having told it that, that's then created my sample template application. Because of the way the mobile SDK works, I have to write Cordova prepare. As you can see, I'm terrible at typing, so I've got that already lined up. So Cordova prepare will then do what it needs to do in order to plumb that into Xcode. So if I then jump out into Xcode, I've already got the simulator running, but if I restart that, so here comes my application, which is currently empty because I haven't done anything. So I then synchronize with Salesforce. That hits my Salesforce org, pulls down all my number of accounts. And I can go into that account, and I can change the number of employees. Save that there. Gives me a little marker to show that there's been a local change. And then I can synchronize that and write that back to Salesforce. Now, and also just to prove that I didn't have that all set up before I came out here, if I run it again, and this time I choose opportunity as the S-object type, again, making sure that I spell things correctly. Stage name, next step. That does what it needs to do. I then do Cordova prepare again. That writes it in. Tell Xcode to restart the simulator. And we wait for a second for that to do its thing. So I cleared down the store before I did this. I've restarted it. So it was accounts before. You saw me go into Burlington Textiles. Now it's opportunities, and I can see the Burlington Textiles weaving plant generator. And I can go and update the next step there, save that, and again, write that to Salesforce. So actually generating my template app now is like about 30 seconds effort, and I've got something that allows me to get started. So if I go back to PowerPoint. So that's basically the code, the demo. So now kind of what the plugin actually does. So the first thing it does, captures some S-object info, which we store. I define the S-object, and I define the fields. The next thing, I read a template file from the template directory, read that into memory. Then I replace any S-object info, so the object type or the fields. I replace that information, and then I write the file out to wherever it needs to go. In this case, it goes into an Xcode directory. And I just loop around, and I do that until I've completed all the template files. OK. So that was the kind of demo and lots of me talking. So now let's have a look at the interesting bits, some of the code. And actually, the really cool thing about this is I didn't have to write very much code at all. Most of it was taken care of by the plugin generator for me. So first thing that my plugin does is capture some input. So as you can see here, what I've done is I've checked, has the user passed me a flag with the SObject type? And if they haven't, then I need to capture that from the user. So built in SFDX core, I haven't had to write that aspect of it. This.ux.prompt. UX is one of the objects that's available from SFDX core. It's got a prompt method, and I just tell it the text that I want to put out, and it captures that information, writes it back into my SObject type property. And note that I'm using a wait because this is like pretty much everything else in JavaScript asynchronous, so I have to wait for that to come back. I then locate the template. Again, this is something that I thought would be more problematic than it actually turned out to be because, again, SFDX core made life easy. So the first command you can see there, I figure out the root directory of the plugin. So what I use there is an extension to the FS object, which is in SFDX core, called traverse for file. So what that does is, given a location, it then works its way up the folder structure, looking for the file that I've named. So here we've got __dir name, and what that means is that's where the file is located on my disk, the file that I'm executing. Not where I'm executing it from, but actually where it's installed, because that's where I care about, that's where my template directory lives. So that's actually really hard to do in a lot of other scripting languages. If you try and do that in Bash, that takes quite a lot of code, but it's really easy. So it's basically start from where I am, and I'm looking for package.json because I've got one of those, and I know that it's the top level of my plugin structure. Having done that, I then generate the template directory name. So I use standard node functionality, path.join, and I say, here's the root directory of where my plugin is. It's then the templates folder and the offline mobile subfolder under that. Path.join, the reason I'm using that is because it's operating system agnostic, so I don't have to worry about do I need forward slashes, do I need backslashes, which operating system am I running on. It's all taken care of for me. And the final thing that I do is actually check to make sure that template directory is there, otherwise it's going to be a bit embarrassing when I try and do something with it. And I can assure you that in a production system and a real system, I would not just have a comment in there when I catch the exception. I would let the user know something about it rather than silently failing. The next thing that I need to do is replace the tokens in the file. So the first thing I do, fs.read file, load it into memory. Again, await, it's an asynchronous file I/O operation. This means that I can treat it like a synchronous call. Once I've got that, I then run the replace standard function on the contents that I've pulled out of that file. And I'm looking for tokens like QS SObject type. That's a token that I've defined. And what I do is I replace that with the property that has either been passed into the to the command, or that I've captured from the user by asking them. Nice little shortcut I found. I need to have these go in quoted. I don't just want the actual text. And if I JSON.stringify them, it puts quotes in there. And I've got another area where I'm putting an array in there. And if I JSON.stringify it, it's in the appropriate array format for a JavaScript source file. So that's quite handy. And then I write the file, and again, asynchronous. I wait for that to complete before I move on. So what this actually looks like is only one file in my templated application that I actually need to replace things, because you would locate these things in a configuration area. So I've got a config function, and in that I've got these two tokens, QSS object type and QS fields. So once I've executed my replacement, that's what it looks like in the application, which has been copied into the Xcode directory. So that was the code, and really that's about all I've had to write. There's probably about 30, 40 lines of code in there. Obviously, I've had to write the offline application, which took me a lot longer to get something that was that useful, but actually being able to reuse that everywhere else is really, really simple with a Salesforce CLI plugin. So lessons I learned. Keep your template applications as simple as possible. It's really easy to start getting excited and think I'll put in some, I'll put in some funky editing, and I'll put in some validation, and I'll put some other bits and pieces in there. Unless you absolutely know that's going to be used by everybody who's going to be using your template, all you're doing is you're putting a tax on them. They've got to remove all that before they can put in the bits that they care about. So even though it feels like you kind of it's quite basic, that's really what you want from a template app. The Salesforce CLI plugin world is very fast moving. So what works in the current version where I've run SFDX plugin generate, if you then run SFDX plugin generate, you probably wouldn't be able to drop my code straight in. Things will have moved on. Things need a little bit of tweaking. I would certainly recommend that rather than taking having an older version of the plugin and using that. And the third thing I guess I learned was that it doesn't have to be Salesforce applications. While most of the examples that you'll see are leveraging the fact that the plugins that are generated will allow you to seamlessly connect to Salesforce, access Salesforce metadata, etc. It is, at the end of the day, just a command line tool on everybody's desktop. So if there's something that everybody needs to do in a consistent way, then this is a really good way of doing it. Finally, here's some links, some useful links, some from me, some from Salesforce. The QR code there will allow you to go straight to this presentation on SlideShare, which has this information in it, everything by the QR code anyway. So hopefully there's some useful stuff in there. That was kind of all I really needed to do this end-to-end, really, which was quite nice. And that's it from me. Are there any questions, apart from why weren't you more prepared with your PowerPoint presentation? Cool, OK. Right, thank you very much for coming along, everyone. Enjoy Metallica.